Yeah, that was.
building itself.
Well, that's theoretical. Yeah, very small. This was in the 80s. All of this. We're just about to do some building work, I'll tell you. But technically, facing north, not east. But anyway. Good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome. Thank you very much for being here this Saturday morning, and welcome to you who are joining us online. And it's great to have my former boss here checking up on me. So Richard and I have known each other for a long time, but then he hired me to be vice principal at Wycliffe Hall while he was principal. Worked together for a number of time. He is ordained in the Church of England, but trained as a historian, which will come out obviously when you hear these presentations, and currently director of an organisation called the Centre for Enterprise Markets and Ethics in Oxford. Lives just north of Oxford with his wife Caroline, who sadly has got COVID, so she was going to be here, and we were going to have a fun weekend. Yeah, but we'll keep him up here anyway, just in case. No. So the format is Wilberforce first, short break, and then Shaftesbury, and some opportunity for some interaction along the way with some PowerPoints up here. So great to have you here. Can I hand straight over to Richard after I've prayed? Father God, thank you that we can enjoy some breakfast together. Thank you for company. Thank you for bringing Richard here. And we pray, Lord, that we would learn from this really significant and important part of our British history. Lord, help us to understand what went on there, what motivated Christians to act and behave in the way they did, and to take away some lessons for today. So we commit this morning to you, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Simon, and it's a delight and a pleasure to be here with you this morning, and a welcome also to those who are watching online. It's a little bit of sort of mechanics beforehand. I brought some material. There's two books, or one booklet and one book on the table. The booklet, which is a little thing I wrote about Wilberforce, which was really a summary of a whole series of lectures that I did. That's a freebie. You can take that away. You just take one. The other book was my biography of Shaftesbury. I've had to buy, so you've got to buy. Well, you don't have to buy it all, but you know, if you want it, it's £10, and either cash or the machine is working, and it all gets sorted out afterwards. So I'm not going to monitor it. Just take a book and pay for it, either to me or through the machine, and we'll sort it all out if you're interested. Wilberforce and Shaftesbury are two of the most important figures in English Christian history. Actually, they're two of the most important figures in English history, and they're two of the most important figures in English social history, in evangelical history, and in Christian history. And yet, although particularly with Wilberforce, because of the link to the abolition of the slave trade, the name is known, we actually have lost sight of their importance for what it means to be a Christian in the public square, and what it means to be a Christian who is able to understand and appreciate the importance of action in the political realm writ large, as well as in the private realm. And one of the characteristics of our modern church has actually been a retreat from those things, a retreat from the very things that Wilberforce and Shaftesbury stood for, into a sort of a pietistic bubble, so that the only thing that matters is whether or not we have salvation. Well, Wilberforce and Shaftesbury both understood the importance of people knowing the Lord, both understood the importance of evangelism and salvation, but they never saw any distinction between that commitment and a wider commitment in society and in the world. Both of these stories raise some questions, and I'm very happy at the end of the talks to have 10, 15 minutes, depending how disciplined I am, in engagement, in questions, in observations, and so on. I'll try and sort of put a few asides in along the way to supply bits of other information. But let's start with William Wilberforce, who you see there was born in 1759 and died in 1833. Wilberforce was not a particularly healthy individual. He struggled throughout his life with medical problems, including taking opium as a way to try and relieve the pain. He had very poor eyesight, and yet he is an iconic figure. An iconic figure, as I said, in British history, Christian history, and evangelical history. His name, of course, is relatively well known and inextricably linked with the campaign against the evils of the slave trade. And in Wilberforce, we discover a Christian who understood public life, a Christian strategist who founded the first evangelical newspaper, a founder with others of a society for moral campaigning in the nation, and one of the earliest overseas missionary societies, the Church Missionary Society. He was the writer of a theological tract and the convener or the gatherer of a group of Christians known as the Clapham Group, often referred to, but actually quite unhelpfully, as the Clapham sect. They never called themselves that. They always called themselves the Clapham Group, and so on. And in Christian history, Wilberforce and Shaftesbury dominate the 100 years from, let's say, 1785 to 1885. And remarkably, they also dominate British social history, with their successful campaigns on the one hand with Wilberforce against the slave trade, and on the other hand with Shaftesbury against child labour. And in this, they both offer significant lessons to Christians, to evangelical Christians today. Now, Wilberforce, of course, like you and me, was not perfect. But we do have a significant figure whose life, work, and faith helped make the world a better place. One of the things I've been doing is reading the accounts of the speeches. I'll quote from some of these, but not all of them. The speeches that Wilberforce made in Parliament on the slave trade. And I've done the same, of course, over the years with Shaftesbury's speeches in Parliament. We'll come to Shaftesbury, of course, later. Many of these speeches last 3 to 4 hours. Can you even imagine listening to a politician of any type, of any stripe, of any party for 3 to 4 hours? How did the other members of Parliament stay awake for 3 to 4 hours? Of course, the reason they did stay awake and pay attention was twofold. Firstly, the central importance to the very being of the nation of the topics under discussion. And secondly, the extraordinary, particularly with Wilberforce here, the extraordinary eloquence, oratory, and rhetoric. No television demanding sound bites. I've done a television interview. It's terrible. It is. It's real. I mean, I sympathise now with all politicians. And I remember once being interviewed by Sky News, 40 seconds to say something significant. You freeze immediately. 40 seconds. Yeah, what am I going to say? You've already lost 10 seconds. So you end up with the sound bite, you know, the sort of the easy things to say. And you go away dissatisfied with all the things you didn't say. But no television, no sound bites. And also, we have to be honest, less of a party machine demanding obedience. And so the individual member had to gain a hearing through persuasion, conviction, and effective campaigning. I'll tell you a little bit later about some of the politics of the time, how these guys operated, and if I don't get there, you can ask me in the questions. But my real question then is, who was William Wilberforce? And we begin then with his faith and his vision, the basis of Wilberforce's zeal, passion, and commitment. Now, unsurprisingly, I make no apology, Christian faith contributes to a better world. I wonder if sometimes we lose sight of that sort of basic principle. Christian faith is important to us personally. Christian faith is important for all sorts of reasons. But Christian faith also contributes to a better world. And what we see in the great Christian statesmen of the 18th and 19th centuries, like Wilberforce and Shaftesbury, is a vision driven by faith, a vision, though, for the well-being and betterment of the whole of society. Actually, an evangelical commitment, a really quite conservative, if you want to put it that way, a quite conservative evangelical commitment, and yet at the same time, a breadth rather than a narrowness. A broad and generous outlook, and yet also a clarity between right and wrong, an acknowledgement of the role of faith in the calling to public life, and a commitment to the truth. Wilberforce and Shaftesbury both understood that the moral law, the law of Christ, we'll talk about this in the sermon tomorrow with the commandments, was good for all people, good for the whole nation, and not something applicable to the Christian alone. What was this faith that Wilberforce adopted? In the middle decades of the 18th century, a revival or awakening swept through Great Britain, parts of Northern Europe and North America. This revival changed individuals and transformed society. Now, we could easily manage another study morning on that. The Wesleys, Whitfield, William Grimshaw, the Countess of Huntingdon, and of course John Newton, who also will feature in our story this morning. This evangelical faith was a faith of particulars rather than generalities, and it was the faith to which Wilberforce was converted. So, William Wilberforce was born into a relatively prominent and prosperous merchant family in Hull on the 24th of August, 1759. Now, Hull, on the east coast of England, not really involved in the slave trade. The slave trade was in the ports on the west coast, Liverpool and Bristol principally. For Hull, prosperous trading port, but with the Baltic nations. That was generally where the trade went. And from quite an early age, Wilberforce came under the influence of people of faith, although his own conversion lay in the future. As we'll see in a minute, this wasn't the faith that his parents held. We have exactly the same with Shaftesbury. Real conflict between the individual and their parents. And considering tomorrow in church, we're looking at the commandment to honour father and mother. It's just an illustration of some of the complexities that we all experience. So Wilberforce's father died when he was about 9, at a very young age. His mother couldn't really cope, and so he was dispatched to an aunt and uncle in Wimbledon. Quite unhelpfully, his uncle was also called William. So you get all sorts of different Williams going around. But William and Hannah Wilberforce in Wimbledon were the aunt and the uncle to whom Wilberforce was sent as a child of 9 because the home situation was complicated. His mother couldn't really cope, and his father had died. Now, William and Hannah had been influenced by the evangelical revival. Hannah Wilberforce, obviously wasn't originally Wilberforce, Hannah Thornton, who became Hannah Wilberforce, was part of the well-known Thornton family, who are very significant in this story. And they were a key family in the history of the evangelical revival. And they actually took William Wilberforce, aged about 12, on a visit to visit a vicar. Well, I mean, what more could you want at the age of 12 than to be taken by the people who are responsible for you for a visit to a vicarage or a rectory? I mean, it must have been wonderful. Well, it was, because that rectory was in Buckinghamshire, and it was in a little village called Olney, and the rector was John Newton. And so the first time that William Wilberforce met John Newton as a 12-year-old in his rectory in Olney. Wilberforce wasn't converted at this point, it's just the beginnings of influence. There's a lot I could say about John Newton, but if I did that, we wouldn't just be here for the morning, we'd be here for the afternoon as well. William, later on, reported that his mother was aghast and heartbroken when he was converted. Aghast and heartbroken that he had become what was termed a Methodist. Now, you've got to remember, when I write stuff and I type Methodist, my computer always demands an uppercase. But there's no uppercase at this time. Methodist was the term that was used of anyone influenced by the evangelical revival in the middle decades of the 18th century. Methodism as a denomination much later, in the late 1780s, before it became a denomination. But the terminology was of anyone influenced by what was known as vital religion, the religion of the particulars, rather than the generalities. He then commented that no parents could have laboured more than his to introduce him to the world and its diversions. Now, Wilberforce was also influenced by a man called Isaac Milner. Now, Milner, 1750 to 1820. He first came across the Milner family at Hull when he went to Hull Grammar School, where the Milner family had come, and Joseph Milner, the father, was the head teacher. And the Milner family came under the influence of the revival, and so became Methodist, as it were. And the moment that happened, Wilberforce's mother was clear he could not continue at Hull Grammar School. Isaac Milner, though, had all the right pedigree. Despite his religious commitments, he was an academic at Cambridge, ticked all of the establishment sort of boxes. He would still be the ideal companion for William Wilberforce on what was known as his European tour. Now, you may well know that at that time, the middle classes and the aristocracy used to send their kids on tours of Europe to experience the culture, to experience the different experiences you can get both intellectually and culturally through a tour of Europe. It was seen as preparing them for life and so on. And these tours would take 1 to 2 years quite often and would involve literally moving around different places in Europe. And we see, again, both Wilberforce and Shaftesbury did this. So, 1784 to 1785, Wilberforce sets off on a tour of Europe accompanied by the evangelical Isaac Milner. There was the two of them, and there was a group of women from the family, cousins and so on, who travelled with them. But the two men were Milner and Wilberforce. And Milner talked to Shaftesbury. He introduced him to the Bible. He opened the Bible with Shaftesbury. He introduced him to New Testament Greek. He introduced him also to the writings of the leading dissenter at the time, a man called Philip Doddridge, who was a very early pioneer of this faith of the revival and wrote a number of significant works that actually influenced both Wilberforce and Shaftesbury. And this paved the way for the opening of Wilberforce's eyes and his conversion. So this is what Wilberforce wrote in his... Oh, we're stuck. Can I have a bit of assistance on... Where's David? Don't know. Oh, there we go. There we go. We got that. So this is what Wilberforce wrote in his diary on the 28th of November, 1785. Just remember here, he's 20, what is he? He's 26. I hope as long as I live to be the better for the meditation of this evening. It was on the sinfulness of my own heart and its blindness and weakness. True Lord, I am wretched and miserable and blind and naked. What infinite love that Christ should die to save such a sinner. God grant I may not deceive myself in thinking I feel the beginnings of gospel comfort. Well, that's Wilberforce's own summary of his conversion. Let's now turn to Wilberforce's call to public life. Wilberforce went to Cambridge. He didn't bother studying, but he went to Cambridge, and he became friendly with the future Prime Minister, William Pitt. Remember, there's two William Pitts, William Pitt the Elder, William Pitt the Younger. We're talking about William Pitt the Younger, essentially the first Prime Minister in the modern sense of understanding a Prime Minister. The history books will tell you that Robert Walpole was the first Prime Minister in the 1720s, but the first Prime Minister in the more modern sense, as a sort of chairman of a cabinet, was Pitt the Younger. Befriended Pitt, and together they visited Parliament. They sat in the public gallery. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Parliament and the public gallery, but certainly the way it's constructed at the moment is, well, you sit behind a screen, and for obvious security reasons and so on, and it's quite interesting, but you are some distance away. This is not the Parliament building we have today. Although our British Parliament looks quite old, it's not. There was a fire it was the 1830s. Might have been 1832, might have been 1837, can't quite remember. There was a fire in the 1830s that then led to the construction of the mock sort of Gothic type building we have now. When Wilberforce and Pitt were visiting Parliament, the public gallery was literally above the chamber. And it was so close you could almost reach down and touch the members. And so you were right in the midst of the hullabaloo and the argument and the debate and the discussion. It is quite extraordinary, if you think about it, that Wilberforce gained election to Parliament at the age of 21. He was elected first for the city of Hull, and then 4 years later for the larger and the more expansive county seat of Yorkshire. In those days, most constituencies were small and often under the control of particular groups or particular people. And there is a story about Hull, which I don't have time to tell, but Hull had a constituency of maybe 1,500 electors, so relatively small. Even in those days, the county seats that elected 2 members were seen as more prestigious. So the county seat for Yorkshire had 20,000 electors. So you can see how that would be seen as a more prestigious place to be. There's always an argument about Wilberforce's politics, which I will try and explain in 30 seconds, and in comparison to Shaftesbury. So Shaftesbury was an arch-conservative, politically, arch-Tory. Wilberforce operated in the generation before, when politics was more fluid and party was more fluid, and there tended to be groups rather than parties. He was elected both to Hull and to Yorkshire as an independent, but he associated with the Tory groups around William Pitt. So that is why you get some argument today over some people saying, oh, he was a Tory, and other people saying, no, he wasn't, he was an independent, It's kind of like both. So he was elected as an independent member, but the groups he associated with were the Tory groups around William Pitt. If you've got more questions on that, we can try and deal with them at the end. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing. Politics was a pretty dirty business then, as now. There's an entry in Shaftesbury's diary complaining bitterly about how much it cost him to buy the beer in order to secure election as the MP for Woodstock. And Wilberforce, as I said, was not physically strong. So, elected to Parliament in 1780, converted in 1785. How was he to marry those two things? Maybe he shouldn't be in Parliament at all. This is what went through his head. Maybe I should go into the church. Maybe I should do something else. Maybe I shouldn't be in public life. Maybe I should be ordained. And he began to have those thoughts, and he consulted Pitt. And Pitt's friendship with Wilberforce remained strong over the years, but there were some strains later on when Pitt was the Prime Minister and Wilberforce was trying to get the anti-slavery stuff through Parliament and so on. But Pitt, interestingly, urged Wilberforce to remain in public life with these words: "If a Christian may act in the several relations in life, must he seclude himself from them all to become so? Surely the principles as well as the practice of Christianity are simple, and lead not to meditation only, but to action." Quite prophetic words, really, from the future Prime Minister William Pitt. But too many Williams. William Pitt. Wilberforce still had some uncertainties, though, and he was by this time a member of the congregation of St Mary Woolnoth. Now, St Mary Woolnoth is a church in the City of London. It's actually the church that is in the shadow of the Bank of England. So it's right at the heart of the city. And that's where Wilberforce had become a member of the congregation. Now, who was the rector of St Mary Woolnoth at this time? It was one John Newton. So Newton, in the early 1780s, moved from Olney in Buckinghamshire to become the second only evangelical rector in the City of London. The first was a man called William Romaine. Different story. So Newton had become the second minister to be appointed as an evangelical, second minister to be appointed to a rectory in the City of London. He was the rector of St Mary Woolnoth. He preached week in, week out. In his congregation was William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce, not unreasonably, decided also to consult his rector. And there is a story about him walking around the square where Newton's vicarage was, or rectory was, at least 3 times before summoning up the courage to knock at the door. And he sought Newton's counsel. And Newton, too, urged Wilberforce to remain in public life. You see, one of the lessons I'm trying to help us with is understanding the providence of God. That you look back and you realize how significant some of these events that may at the time have seemed not particularly significant actually are, in this case, in the life of William Wilberforce. Later on, Newton wrote this: "It is hoped and believed that the Lord has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation." Well, Wilberforce was now ready, having in his heart come to that view that he was indeed called to public life to serve both God and nation. He was now ready to turn to new causes, not only the slave trade, which we'll come to in a minute, but other matters also, both in relation to society and to faith, including the establishment of the first evangelical Christian newspaper in 1802, the Christian Observer, and the publication of a widely popular theological tract called A Practical View. We won't really discuss the Christian Observer this morning just because we won't have time. I will say a little later about his book, A Practical View. So 1786, Wilberforce returns to the public arena, returns to public life, a changed man. This is what he says 1 year later, 1787. "God Almighty has set before me 2 great objects: the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." Now, look, this is the late 1700s. You're going to get some strange language. What he meant by the reformation of manners was the moral state of the nation. That's what he meant. I mean, it comes over strangely when you read it in those terms. He was talking about the moral state of the nation. And the first thing that happened, 1787, the King, George III, under Christian influence, under evangelical Christian influence, issued a proclamation for the encouragement of piety and virtue. Now, I don't know about you, I'm a great monarchist, That doesn't mean I think every monarch's been wonderful. Of course not. But I think of some of the examples we've had, including with our late Queen, Elizabeth, and some of the wonderful examples of faith that we have had demonstrated to us as a nation. And here, George III issuing this proclamation to encourage among the nation piety and virtue. And Wilberforce took the opportunity, and he gathered together the great and the good, peers, members of parliament, bishops, and of course the Prime Minister by this time, William Pitt the Younger, to form what became known as the Proclamation Society. Now, the proclamation being referred to there isn't actually the proclamation of the gospel or the proclamation of something else. It's to do with the proclamation that the king had issued, encouraging moral principles in society. What were they concerned with? Everything from drunkenness, gambling, prostitution, public decency, and so on. In 1802, it was renamed as the Society for the Suppression of Vice. I know these names, but never mind. It was renamed the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and it remained the evangelical vanguard for campaigns and public morality for some decades. Well, let me now turn to Wilberforce's campaign against the slave trade. Wilberforce was a member of Parliament for 45 years. When we come to Shaftesbury, Shaftesbury was a member of Parliament for 60 years. These are significant, long-term commitments to public life. And what we see in both of them is a passion, a youthful passion to begin with. Shaftesbury was elected to Parliament at 25, Wilberforce at 21. A youthful passion formed into shape over the years of experience, combined with faith and an acute sense of calling to public life. And those influences shape character. They shape who you are, how you behave, how you conduct yourself. And that's what we see with Wilberforce. The first thing we see is his perseverance and tenacity. Now, Wilberforce accepted the mantle of leading the parliamentary campaign against the slave trade in March 1787 at a dinner with this man, Thomas Clarkson, 1760 to 1846. Thomas Clarkson, very important figure in all of this, not a name that's known. I remember when I was Simon's boss at Wycliffe, I remember leading a mission in the parish of Rothley in Leicestershire and discovering to my joy that it was the parish where Thomas Clarkson had been in place. He wasn't a minister. And some of the locals were really fired up by the Clarkson story, and it was really interesting. So Clarkson, devout Christian. Interestingly, Clarkson, very close links with the Quakers. And the Quakers have an important part to play in the campaign against slavery. And it can get confusing, because when you talk about the Quakers in Christian circles today, people think of today's Quakers and maybe have some questions. I would probably share those questions. Back in these days, by and large, the Quakers were very committed Christians, and there were even a group of evangelical Quakers who were very significant. And as an aside, in 1832, the Quaker annual yearly meeting, their senior body, actually passed a resolution declaring the Holy Scriptures as the sole and final authority in all matters of life and faith. Very interesting and a bit different from what we'd see today. So Clarkson and Wilberforce had dinner with a member of Parliament called Sir Charles Middleton. Charles Middleton was a Tory MP and a prominent abolitionist. Again, try not to get too much. It's quite hard sometimes to compare the politics of then to the politics of today. You can do it, but you've got to be a bit cautious. Basically, the Tory party were the abolitionist party. I know you may think, oh no, surely it would be terrible terminology, I acknowledge, but the left of the spectrum. No, the more liberal part of the spectrum was pro-slavery. We'll come to some of the reasons for that in a minute. Most of the abolitionists were found in the ranks of the Tories, And when we come to Shaftesbury, all the opponents of child labour were found in the Tory ranks. Very interesting, just in a sort of wider sort of reflection. So Wilberforce's first speech against the slave trade was on the 12th of May, 1789. Technically, it was on a debate on a report from the Privy Council on the slave trade. He was praised inside and outside the House for his speech. But the pro-slave trade lobby forced first an adjournment and then a delay. Now, I used to be the chairman of the business committee of the General Synod of the Church of England, so I know all about how to block things, even if you can't get things through. And so you go for an adjournment. You know, something you think is going the wrong way, you move for an adjournment in an attempt to sort of buy time. Or you move for a, let's come back to this in 6 months' time, or 12 months' time, or whatever, and so on. So began Wilberforce's long journey. And over the next 18 years, he faced frustration, delay, opposition, and defeat before the achievement of the abolition in 1807. But he didn't give up. He persevered. This tenacity was a real testament to his faith and character. He understood that he had been called by God to this task and was able to focus on that higher calling to carry him through year in, year out. This is what he said, not in that speech, but in a different speech in 1791. Never, never will we desist till we have wiped away this scandal from the Christian name, released ourselves from the load of guilt under which we at present labour, and extinguished every trace of this bloody traffic, of which our prosperity, looking back to the history of these enlightened times, will scarce believe it has been suffered to exist, so long a disgrace and dishonour to this country. So, firstly, his perseverance and tenacity. Secondly, the marshalling of evidence. I think it's probably worth saying at this point that the issue of slavery and the slave trade was a complexity in the national mind, and it was a complexity in the Christian mind, and it was a complexity in the evangelical mind. And it is inaccurate to say, well, all the bad people were in favour of slavery and all the goodies were in favour of its abolition. It wasn't like that at all. For the majority of the period up to the 1750s, the existence of slavery and the slave trade was largely accepted. Largely accepted in the nation, largely accepted among Christians, rarely questioned, other than by the Quakers, which we'll come to in a minute. It was a sort of an enlightening of the mind during the period of the middle decades of the 18th century among Christians, and as we will see, also among others. But what we see throughout the campaign against the slave trade is the painstaking collection, marshalling, assessment, and deployment of evidence. A process, of course, that could not be short-circuited. Of course, Wilberforce himself was not the prime collector, though he was central to its assessment and presentation to Parliament. Wilberforce was assisted by two members of the Clapham Group. We'll come to the Clapham Group in a few minutes. James Stephen, who was a lawyer, and Thomas Clarkson, who we've already mentioned, who set out to gather the evidence for presentation to Parliament. It was Clarkson who sought out key witnesses such as John Newton. And John Newton became an absolutely key witness in the campaign against the slave trade. He wrote an autobiography reflecting on his own experience as being the captain of a slave trading ship. We have to be honest with ourselves as Christians. Newton captained the slave trading ships after he became a Christian. We just need to be honest and not pretend that it was all wonderful. And then he later came to this conviction that it was wrong and it was evil. He looked back and he wrote about his experience. And in particular, Clarkson gathered evidence from the slave trading ships that were entering and leaving Bristol and Liverpool. He noted that there was also loss and poor conditions for the crews of the ships, as well as the slaves. Now, you've got to remember, Britain very rarely saw slaves. There are some exceptions to that, but very rarely did we see slaves, because we weren't in the bit where the slaves were. The goods left Bristol, went to Africa, were sold, slaves were then purchased, taken to the West Indies and the southern plantations of the American South, sold, more goods, cotton and so on, loaded on the ships and brought back to Liverpool and Bristol. So you're standing in Liverpool and Bristol, you just see goods being traded. You don't see, generally speaking, the slaves. And so Clarkson says, you know, it's not just the conditions of the slaves, it's also the conditions of the crew. Note there the subtlety and niche nature of the evidence being gathered, all designed to be pieces of a jigsaw that are fitted together. Thomas Clarkson interviewed 3,000 seamen across 320 ships in order to track down witnesses willing to testify to the conditions that they saw. He was also responsible for the widespread circulation of this drawing, which was a slave trading ship called the Brooks in 1789, simply designed to show the overcrowding and the terrible sort of conditions. Well, let me move quickly on. Third area, Wilberforce's eloquence and oratory. We have lost both the practice and the experience of oratory. This is what William Hague, who wrote a biography of Wilberforce, and it's a good biography. Hague's biography of Wilberforce is a good biography. Hague, not a Christian, but actually did manage to grasp the importance of Wilberforce's face. This is what Hague said about Wilberforce's first speech in 1789 on the slave trade. Wilberforce would cast off his physical fragility that afternoon to deliver a speech which, even set against the centuries of debates in the House of Commons, stands out as one of the true masterpieces of parliamentary oratory. Another biographer, Robin Furneaux, describes Wilberforce's speech as a rousing patriotic oration, a polished and masterful performance. Hague, that it was a comprehensive statement of the arguments. Now, one of the statesmen of the day, a man called Edmund Burke, who you've probably heard of, Burke, 1729 to 1797, praised Wilberforce's speech as masterly, impressive, and eloquent, and declared that it contained principles so admirable that he had never heard the like of in modern oratory. The Speaker of the House and the Prime Minister both praised Wilberforce. Now, you know, you will come across historians who say, oh, it's all a bit of an invented story. It's these Christians trying to build up Wilberforce into a figure that he really isn't. It's nonsense. Wilberforce is a significant figure in public life. Not perfect, of course. Significant figure in public life. And here, the Speaker, the Prime Minister, praising Wilberforce's speech. So, and then the deployment of argument. The eloquence and oratory, however, was not empty, but filled with the content of detailed and careful argument, a consequence of the long, hard work of gathering evidence and the tenacity in presenting the case to Parliament. The key arguments deployed were around economics, trade, evidence of mistreatment, justice, moral arguments, and faith. Interesting, all of those arguments were presented. Arguments about economics and trade, evidence of mistreatment, justice, and faith. The proponents of the slave trade tended to argue that employment depended upon the trade, and that the maintenance of the plantations required the importation of slaves. So their argument was, if you stop the slave trade, you will cause mass unemployment. You will cause mass unemployment because the plantations will be forced to close, and you will lose all of the ships and all of the consequent employment in the industries in this country that supply the ships. Interestingly, Wilberforce's appeal was to the principles of free trade. His argument was that the real solution lay in free international trading relationships based upon true commercial principles. So his argument is, actually, your argument about you need slavery in order to maintain employment is a distortion of the principles of free trade. The real solution here lies in the free trading nations of the world operating together on basic commercial principles. He also set before the House year after year, as you would imagine, the detailed evidence of the mistreatment of the enslaved peoples. He presented arguments about morality and justice and leadership. The trade, he said, was an offence against liberty and dignity. What about faith? He introduced arguments about faith, but with a degree of caution and care. Very rarely did he start with those arguments. As time went on, actually, they became more significant and more prominent. He tended to start his argument from wider moral and economic positions, but he made clear that the trade was an affront to God. But as time went on, he became more explicit that the evil trade was a denial of God's providential purposes and invited judgment upon the nation. One example, this is from a letter he published in 1807. Providence governs the world, but if we are not blind to the course of human events, as well as utterly deaf to the plain instructions of revelation, by which he means the revelation of Holy Scripture, not the book of Revelation, we must believe that a continued course of wickedness, oppression, and cruelty, obstinately maintained in spite of the fullest knowledge and the loudest warnings, must infallibly bring down upon us the heaviest judgments of the Almighty. Well, a couple more things to do. I'm probably going to take another 7 minutes, so we'll finish about 25 past, which is probably just about okay. So bear with me. Central to Wilberforce's effectiveness was his ability to build coalitions with others. We see this in his campaigning against the slave trade, both inside and outside of Parliament, both within and beyond his sympathisers in the faith. Now, this is surely an important lesson for us in our modern campaigns, that we draw people together who may not agree in every regard, but are willing to come together for the achievement of a common objective. If I may, just as an aside, although the danger of asides is I disrupt my discipline on time, in the campaign against same-sex marriage, which was authorised by Parliament, which I remember one critic describing same-sex marriage as a policy invented in Islington, which we thought was quite accurate. I remember, irrespective of the ins and outs, I remember having dinner in an Indian restaurant in London. And the owner of the restaurant came round and distributed leaflets, who's a Muslim, in opposition to same-sex marriage. It was the day before the vote. And my colleague and I looked at him and talked with him, and he said, we've only just realised this is happening before Parliament. Can you imagine the power had Christians and Muslims actually collaborated together in a much longer-term campaign on that matter, and the influence and importance. We may face that again really quite soon on matters such as assisted suicide, which I refuse to call assisted dying. We'll come to that perhaps in the sermon tomorrow. So, first then, Wilberforce built a broad coalition of faith. The Quakers, who I mentioned earlier, were the first group out of the blocks in relation to slavery. 1754. If I remember rightly, Newton stopped captaining his slave trading ships somewhere between the early 1750s. So, you know, he's basically still doing this, and the Quakers are out of the blocks. The Society of Friends in Philadelphia declared that slavery was neither consistent with Christianity or with common justice. A Quaker anti-slavery tract was distributed in 1760 to every member of both houses of Parliament. 1761, the Quaker London Yearly Meeting passed a resolution declaring the slave trade repugnant to Christianity. Evangelicals and Quakers were now drawn together, and they collaborated together in the formation of what became known as the Abolition Society in 1789. 9 Quakers and 3 evangelicals, including the Clapham-linked Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson. Now, one of the things you've got to remember about the Quakers at this point is they were unable to sit in Parliament. They were prevented by law from sitting in Parliament, as the Roman Catholics were. So if you've got a Quaker-dominated group with a national campaign, you still need a parliamentary spokesman. And that's where Wilberforce and the Clapham evangelicals came in. Secondly, he established a popular coalition in the country. Slavery was not only opposed by people of faith, and the coalition in the country went across and beyond faith communities. I've mentioned the writings of John Newton. There was also the writings of Hannah More, another very significant evangelical figure of the times, who wrote a poem called Slavery. And Hannah More is significant because she was a prominent member of London society. She was a playwright and a poet, all of the things that didn't normally match up with being a committed evangelical Christian. So she had influence, and her poem and Newton's account widely circulated. The popular campaign you can read about, it was extraordinary. Sermons were preached, meetings were held, boycotts. There were petitions laid on the communion tables in churches, so that at the end of services, people would go up to the communion table to sign a petition against the slave trade. 6% of the entire population signed petitions against the slave trade. If that was today, it would be nearly 5 million people. Very significant numbers. Josiah Wedgwood, of pottery fame, distributed a medallion which contained the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And thirdly, managing and uniting Parliament. Wilberforce was a master of parliamentary procedure. You see, he'd been there since the age of 21. He'd learned the ropes. And ultimately, he managed to unite a divided Parliament. Just a few final things about Wilberforce as a strategist. Firstly, the Clapham Group, just briefly. A few miles from Westminster, community of Christian MPs, lawyers, business people, came together, built on the estates around Clapham Common from the year 1792 to 1808. They prayed and worshipped together in the parish church. They took counsel from each other. They acted as a conduit for the campaign in the country. There were visitors, there were meetings, there was planning. It was another example of Wilberforce's coalition building. And this group was a significant element in evangelical philanthropy, moral campaigning, and witness. The estates were put together by the Thornton family, who purchased, firstly, a house that doesn't exist anymore, called Battersea Rise House, where Wilberforce lived with his wife, Barbara, for many years. And this group had a variety of gifts. There were lawyers, there were administrators, and there were parliamentarians. From about 1808, the group began to disperse, which probably just tells us that it's an inspiration to learn from rather than just a model to copy. But anyway, that's a slightly different matter. The Proclamation Society we've already dealt with. The Church Missionary Society, founded in 1799. Christian Observer in 1802. And I just want to say a few words about a practical view. 1797, in the midst of his campaign against the slave trade, Wilberforce publishes a theological tract. Now, Wilberforce wasn't a great intellect, and he wasn't a great writer. You can get hold of this. It's very easy to get hold of online. It's not the easiest read. There tends to be quite a bit of turgid. It tends to be quite turgid in places. It tends to be repetitive in places. But what you've got is Wilberforce setting out his Christian beliefs. He was a better speaker than he was writer. Listen to the full title. A practical view of the prevailing religious system of professed Christians in the higher and middle classes in this country, contrasted with real Christianity. No wonder it just gets referred to as a practical view. You could have a lecture just on the complexities of the title. Publisher was cautious. Religious books, they don't really sell well. Some of Wilberforce's own friends advised against publishing. There's not going to be much demand. The publisher risked 500 copies on the first run. They were sold out within 5 days. Within 6 months, 7,500 copies had been sold. The book was a national sensation and went through 15 editions in Wilberforce's lifetime and became a bestseller. Well, let me just illustrate with one quote, and then I'll few words of conclusion. His real argument was, much of Christianity is about generalities, but it's really about particulars. And the quote, how dexterously do they avail themselves of any plausible plea for introducing some weekday employment into the Sunday, whilst they have not the same propensity to introduce any of the Sunday's particular employment into the rest of the week. So it's a wholeness of life question that he's trying. He's saying, nominal Christians, it's Sunday attendance, and then the rest of the week just as normal. What he's saying is, it's a whole of life question. So some conclusions. Firstly, faith does matter. Christianity is a central guiding force for the identification of right and wrong and common action. Second, though, building broad and wide coalitions to achieve common objectives is central to success. And thirdly, the development of character, tenacity and perseverance over the long term. With both Wilberforce and Shaftesbury, we see the sheer range of activities across the whole spectrum of public life and morality. That's one of the abiding observations from both of these characters. Anyway, finally, 5th of February 1807, the then new Prime Minister, William Grenville, everybody's called William, William Grenville introduced what was to become the abolition bill that would pass Parliament. It was introduced in the House of Lords, and Wilberforce sat, as a Member of Parliament, sat in the gallery. The Prime Minister, at the end of his speech, was effusive in his praise of Wilberforce. I cannot conceive any consciousness more truly gratifying than must be enjoyed by that person on finding a measure to which he's devoted the colour of his life carried into effect, a measure so truly benevolent, so admirably conducive to the virtuous prosperity of his country and the welfare of mankind, a measure which will diffuse happiness among millions now in existence, and for which his memory will be blessed by millions yet unborn. There is a tradition in the House of Commons that you don't applaud. Well, the record tells us that when the Prime Minister sat down, the House burst into applause. Thank God for William Wilberforce. So, we probably have a couple of minutes for questions, and then we need a bit of a break for coffee and things. So, any questions at this point? Yes.
Hang on, George.
Right. Or the North Atlantic slave trade. Can you just expand on that for me a little bit?
That's exactly correct. So what was abolished in 1807 was the trade in slaves, not slavery itself. So the campaign continued. The reason they went for the slave trade rather than slavery itself was a step-by-step approach. They reckoned they had more chance of success by getting rid of the trade first. And the campaign continued. What's really so interesting is that by the time you get to 1833, Wilberforce died just before the abolition of slavery received royal assent in 1833. That was the same year that Shaftesbury took up the mantle of what became known as the white slave trade, inverted commas. We don't have time to discuss it, I don't think, but of course, one of the complexities of the abolition of slavery itself in 1833 was the level of compensation that was to be or was not to be given to the owners of the plantations. And that's generated some recent controversy because Gladstone's family were slave owning and they received compensation, and there's been some recent criticism. I don't actually share the criticism, but there's been some recent criticism Liverpool University took Gladstone's name, and Gladstone was a sort of, a sort of liberal-minded politician, and a famous and important politician in the 19th century. They take his name off the buildings because his family accepted some money in compensation for the loss of a plantation. But that was done to make sure the bill went through. So, 1807, the abolition of the slave trade. 1833, the abolition of slavery in the British colonies. Between 1800 and 1833, the British Navy enforced the abolition of the trade by force on the waters. Remember, abolition of slavery in America not till the 1860s.
Slavery in many other parts of the world.
Yes, I mean
before the North Atlantic slave trade was abolished.
And there is issues in relation to the Dutch, in particular, and one of the arguments, in fact, of the pro-slave trade lobby was, well, if we abolish the slave trade, the Dutch will just take it all on. So, they'll get our business. I will do my best to generate a bit of more question time.
Richard, that's great. Thanks. We're halfway through. Thank you so much, Richard. Looking forward to the rest. We're going to take a 20-minute break. So if we reconvene at 10:02, there is actually a little bit more breakfast and coffee left. Do want to say thank you to Nora and Clive so much for breakfast. So yeah, just stretch your legs, and we'll come back at 10:02, and we will have a hard finish at 12. So.
some time at the end for questions on both sessions, if people still have questions from the first session. The parliamentary election at which William Wilberforce left Parliament was the parliamentary election at which Lord Shaftesbury, as he later was, entered Parliament. And Lord Shaftesbury stands as the example par excellence of an evangelical, conservative, campaigner and reformer in society and in the church, with a passionate concern for the gospel in the public square, for Christian moral principles, and for religious liberty. Just to sort of fire you up a little bit, here are a few quotes I've dug out from Shaftesbury. I've been studying Shaftesbury for 20-odd years, and in fact I've just been commissioned to produce an edited volume of his parliamentary speeches. But you occasionally, when you're researching and digging stuff out and reading, you just find a few gems that are timeless. So here are just a few of those. So this is Shaftesbury, 1885. I know what constituted an evangelical in former times. I have no clear notions of what it constitutes now. Another one, 1868, such will be the religion of the future, in which Vishnu, Muhammad, meaning Muhammad, Jupiter and Jesus Christ will all be upon a level. It's quite prophetic for the times. This is what will happen going forward. I hope I'm not going to offend anyone with the next one. This is what he said, it's not what I say. Though I do agree with it. I'm not such a lover of episcopacy, so to think it necessary to salvation. And finally, were Arius alive today, he would be promoted to Canterbury. Arius was a heretic of the early church who denied the divinity of Christ. Anyway, let's move on from the fun. Shaftesbury encompasses a vast range of insight and commitments which demonstrate the central place of evangelical faith in his life's work. He was determined to stand for the gospel in all its fullness, to allow nothing to stand in the way of the promotion of the missionary enterprise, both at home and overseas, but also to bring an explicit evangelical Christian outlook to bear upon the social questions of the day, and to oppose both Catholic, as he saw it, both Catholic and liberal distortions of the faith. This is what we're going to run through. A little bit about his theological principles. We're then going to look at Shaftesbury the legislator, his campaigns in Parliament. Shaftesbury the Protestant campaigner, which might make your hair stand on end. His commitment to the voluntary Christian societies, it's a very important part of his life and work. And then something that's never talked about. No, I've never seen any public lecture given on this. I've never seen anything really written about it. And that is one of the most extraordinary stories of the middle decades of the 19th century in Christian history. The weekly services held in the Garrick and other theatres of Theatreland, pioneered by Shaftesbury and his friends. Well, Anthony Ashley Cooper, he was an aristocrat. Anthony Ashley Cooper was the family name, born on the 28th of April 1801 into an aristocratic family with landed estates in Dorset. I've just been invited to give a lecture next year at the anniversary of St John's Wimborne, whose founding trustee was one Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, the exact person that we're talking about. Now, he was known as Lord Ashley, so I will use it a little bit interchangeably in quotes and things. His courtesy title was Lord Ashley until he succeeded to the earldom in 1851. So there'll be a little bit of just interchanging of the terminology. As I hinted at the previous talk, Shaftesbury's family life was difficult. His relationship with his parents, less
than congenial. He described his mother as unkind, and both his parents as guilty of dereliction of duty. Said they were more interested in their social calendar than bringing up their children in the faith. He entered Parliament in 1826 as a Tory, first of all for the pocket borough of Woodstock, very close to where I live, and then subsequently, rather like Wilberforce, starting a pocket borough, then he went to the county seat of Dorset. He remained in one house or the other for the next 59 years until his death in 1885, apart from one gap of 18 months. He was elected for the county seat of Dorset, which you can imagine was heavily agricultural. One of the big wider political debates at the time, which we're not going to concentrate on here, was the debate about the Corn Laws. So should farmers' incomes be protected by imposing tariffs, or should you have cheaper food for the poor, I suppose, for the wider population? Slightly caricatured, but that was roughly the debate. Shaftesbury was elected from an agricultural district to represent the farmers, and he completely changed his mind on the Corn Laws. And he said, I no longer believe it's right to protect the farmer's income at the expense of cheaper food for the wider population. And therefore, he said, as a matter of principle, I resign my seat in Parliament. Oh, who does that today? Change in a matter of principle. And no, I was elected 3 years ago, and the electorate will have another go in 3 years. I'm not going now. Because he changed on a fundamental principle, he said, I have to resign my seat. He resigned, stood in the by-election, and was defeated. But it's a man of principle that we're dealing with. 18 months later, he was back in Parliament for the constituency of Bath, but that's a different matter. Shaftesbury was repeatedly offered cabinet office throughout his long political life, interestingly by prime ministers of both political parties. He was an ardent Tory, but he was offered cabinet office by the prime ministers of both political parties. In 1866, he turned down in that 1 year the 3 great offices of state. He said he refused. I'm not sure that he would have been suitable for high office. That's a different matter, though. But he turned down high office, he said, because it would have required him to surrender his life's Christian work. Now, one of the considerable influences on Shaftesbury as a boy was the family housekeeper, Maria Millis. Just interesting, isn't it? So the difficult relationship with the parents, influence in this case of the housekeeper, who put the young aristocrat on her knee, taught him to pray, and read him the scriptures. You never know what influence you're going to have with the young folk and the children that you come across, that you have relationship with, whether they're your own or others. You never know what influence there's going to be. And he described Maria Millis as an affectionate and a pious woman who taught him to pray and read to him from the scriptures. Shaftesbury, like Wilberforce, was not perfect. He had a darker side. He suffered from depression. I mean, there are some who say he was a manic depressive, and you can see it in his diaries, the dark clouds coming over. I find this quite appealing in the sense that here are people who suffer the same things that we all suffer from. I'm not saying we all suffer from that, but people suffer from all sorts of conflicts and issues and difficulties in their life, and so do these great names. Florence Nightingale said that if Lord Shaftesbury had not been committed to the reform of the asylum, he would have been in one. But there we go. Converted in 1826. There's a story about his conversion. If you read the biographies, they will tell you he's converted in 1834 or 1835. If you read my biography, it'll tell you he was converted in 1826. That's because the earlier biographies were written by people who were not Christians, and they completely misunderstood the adoption of a particular view on a particular matter as conversion. And certainly my own thesis, which was about Lord Shaftesbury, the examiners said, you have absolutely convinced us that we're talking here about a conversion to faith in 1826. He immediately said this: I want nothing but usefulness to God and my country. That's quite similar, isn't it, to what Wilberforce said? It's not the same, but it's quite similar. So you're back to this whole idea of calling, that deep calling in the heart to serve God. Well, before we turn to his campaigns, we should, albeit briefly, set out his theological beliefs. Exactly like Wilberforce, he believed that humanity was corrupt and flawed, that the human heart deceitful and wicked. Forgiveness, he said, could be obtained only through the death of Jesus on the cross. So a pessimistic view of humanity, but contrasted with an optimistic view of God. The message of salvation, he said, needed to be carried afar. 5 key elements to Shaftesbury's theology. I'll just run through them very quickly and give a couple of examples. Firstly, the Bible and Protestantism. This was the bedrock of his faith, the Protestant position of the authority of Scripture. I'll give an illustration of that in a minute. Secondly, Catholicity, by which he meant the uniting of Christians across denominations. It was his life's passion. He was a committed Anglican, but his life's passion was bringing Christian people together in voluntary societies, bringing Christian people together in missionary societies, in societies for social welfare, in societies to provide housing for people in London, all designed to be a reflection of his belief that Christians needed to work together across denominational boundaries. He believed in the principle of lay agency, that the principle, that is, of the key role of the lay agent, the lay worker, the lay person in public and church life. He believed in scripture readers, parish visitors, the ragged school teachers. We'll come to the ragged schools in a few minutes. The ragged school teachers, these, he said, is where the heart of the faith lies. These people, he said, can get into places the ordained minister can't get into. There's a famous quote. I haven't got it on my sheet. This is the danger, really, because I took this out to save time, and of course I'm about to put it back in. I gave a talk on Shaftesbury many years ago to the Diocesan Conference of the Diocese of Liverpool, and I was about to come to this quote when I looked up and realised that not only the Bishop of Liverpool at the time, but also the Dean of the Cathedral was sitting in the front row, and Shaftesbury said that a multiplication of cathedrals will sink the church. The lay agent may save it. But anyway, I did it anyway, which is probably why I'm standing here. Anyway, the lay agent. The unity of body and soul. Interestingly, one of the criticisms of evangelical faith is we have a tendency to separate body and soul. That we tend to say, the soul matters, are you on the train to heaven? And, oh yeah, all that other, yeah, it doesn't matter about the other stuff. Shaftesbury said, no. Body and soul belong together. And if body and soul belong together, therefore we should have as much concern for, yes, the eternal destiny of the soul, but also the material, social, and temporal well-being of the body. And then finally, eschatology. Big thing in the 19th century, eschatology. Massive distraction in a whole number of ways. Eschatology, a concern for the end times. Without talking for 2 hours about eschatology, Shaftesbury's position was that he had a passion for the second advent of Christ, the second coming. That, he said, is the basis of our hope. But he said we are not to be concerned with the details. The problem are those who are concerned with the details more than the principle. Let me just give a few examples by way of quotes. There's lots I could give, but I just got a couple of examples. So, let us then as Protestants stand by that which alone was the pillar and ground of truth, the Bible, the whole Bible, and nothing but the Bible. That was in the Record newspaper, 16th of May, 1839. The Record, so basically I told you that Wilberforce founded the Christian Observer in 1802. In shorthand terms, by the time you got to the 1830s, the Christian Observer was viewed as wet and having sort of lost its way. And so the slightly more ardent founded another newspaper called the Record. And the people who gathered around the Record became known as the Recordites, members of Parliament, others, and so on. Shaftesbury was a key player in all of that. That eventually got absorbed into what became the Church of England newspaper, but there we are. The Bible, he argued, was its own missionary. That was one of his great passions. He was the president of the Bible Society for most of his life. The Bible, he said, is its own missionary. All you need is to read the Bible. And he said, access to the scriptures protects the poor man from clerical domination. Passionate layperson. Said the access to the scriptures is what protects the laity from being told by the clergy, this is what you must believe. Anyway, it's the Bible. On interdenominational unity, he made, among other things, this statement to the annual meeting of the London City Mission in 1863, another of the societies he was involved with. We'll come to those later. This is an extraordinary statement for its times, the 1860s. This is what he said, the annual meeting. Put all that aside, let all establishments and all distinctive churches sink into the ground, compared with the one great effort to preach the doctrine of Christ crucified to every creature on the earth, to every creature that can be reached on this habitable globe. One of the things I'm trying to get over with Shaftesbury, it was his equal passion for Christian evangelism and social action in the public square. He saw no distinction between those things. And in respect of eschatology, the second advent, he said, this summarizes what I said, the second advent, he says, is an all-sufficient remedy, should be prayed for, and as a promise should be looked for. The mode, form, and manner of that event are not revealed, and therefore no business of ours. See, quite a good way of focusing on the principle and not being distracted by the detail. Now, eschatology at the time sometimes led to quietism in the face of social evil. So, if you believed that Jesus was going to return soon, and to use the terminology, the theological terminology, if you were a premillennialist, the immediate soon return of Jesus in order to sort of change the world. Shaftesbury was a premillennialist. The danger, if you like, is, well, Jesus is coming back next Tuesday, therefore I don't need to do anything. That's this, I summarize, you note. But the immediacy of the return, and some people spent their lives trying to work out dates, which is exactly what Shaftesbury says, but that's what we're not told not to do. But if Jesus is coming back next week, then we don't need to do anything other than go and wait on the top of the hill in our white tents for the Lord to return, because he'll sort it all out when he comes back next Tuesday. This is what Shaftesbury said. I'm now looking not to the great end, but to the interval. I know, my friends, how great and glorious that end will be. But while I find so many persons looking to no end, and others rejoicing in that great end, and thinking nothing about the interval, I confess that my own sympathies and fears dwell much with what must take place before that great consummation. Again, language is a bit Victorian, but he said, look, there are some people who deny that Christ is going to return. There are other people who are so obsessed with the return of Christ, that's all they think about. We need to think about what he described as faithful discipleship before the return of Jesus. That, he said, was the key. So let me turn to Shaftesbury, the legislator, and Shaftesbury's work in Parliament. Shaftesbury's work in Parliament covered some 60 years. His work ranged from mental health. His very first speech in Parliament in 1828 was on the subject of mental health. You can go to Hansard. It's one of the earliest editions of Hansard that exists. And you can go and you see it recorded. Lord Ashley's comments were so faint and inaudible he could be barely heard. That's all you get in Hansard. Nervous, all of those things. Very first speech. He was concerned with housing for the poor, for compensation for those whose homes were displaced by the construction of the railways. Remember, this was the great period of the construction of the great railroads and the great railways. Houses, particularly the housing for the poor, was just swept out of the way. Shaftesbury forced legislation through Parliament to ensure that people whose houses were swept away were properly compensated for their loss. The payment of wages on site rather than in public houses. I have a quote I'm not going to give about a bill later in the 1870s where Shaftesbury forced through Parliament a requirement for wages to be paid in money on the site of the factory. And he said, 90% of the women in this land will thank me for this task. And what happened was the factory owners were in cahoots with the owner of the public house. You'd get to Friday, weekly wages. You'd get to Friday lunchtime, payment of wages, there's a delay. The public house owner would open the public house, come on in, while we wait for the wages. Oh, you need some credit. I'll give you some credit. And they would drink, there would be drunkenness, credit would be run up, the wages would be paid at 4:30, 5 p.m., and half of them, 3/4 of them, whatever the percentage was, would immediately be taken to displace the credit that they'd run up. And the workers would go home with nowhere near the amount of money they were due. Shaftesbury introduced legislation to ensure that wages were paid on site in a wages office. That's the origin of the wages office. Now, of course, it's all by direct transfer. But he was concerned about the protection of children in factories, the child labour campaign, which you may be familiar with, and with child sweeps. I give the list in order to illustrate the breadth of concern on these matters. He made over 200 speeches in Parliament, just like Wilberforce, many of them several hours long. Sponsored legislation, promoted bills and reforms, at all times invested with his evangelical Christian faith. I'm going to give two examples around child labour. You've got to remember at this time, England's being industrialised. There's this big movement of labour from country to city. But also there's the accumulation of capital in the cities. Big factories requiring 24-hour working. And so you've got an accumulation of capital, you've got a demand for labour, the pulling in of labour from country into city, and a demand that exhausts the supply. Well, what's the solution? We'll employ the children. And if you are a poor parent and you have insufficient money and you're living in poverty, the attraction even to you of the employment of the child in the factory where the father works, if there is a father, is shockingly attractive. Child labour was cheap, it was available, and it was controllable. Until the Factory Act of 1836, which Shaftesbury sponsored, there was no restriction at all on the hours that children could work. Now, the main proponent of factory legislation in Parliament at this point was the Tory MP for Leeds, Michael Thomas Sadler. Sadler himself was an active evangelical Christian. He lost his seat in the 1832 general election. Now, the 1832 general election was a bit like our general election of 2024. The Tories went down big. Sorry, avoid the politics. But I mean, it was exactly like there was a landslide. It was the election of the Great Reform Act. The Duke of Wellington was the Tory leader. Great military leader swept out. And a lot of MPs, a lot of Conservative MPs, Tory MPs, lost their seats, including Michael Sadler, who represented Leeds. So the problem was, who was to take up the mantle of what Robert Southey, the Pope Laureate of the day, described as our white slave trade. Now, there was another evangelical Tory who was concerned with this matter, Scottish MP called Sir Andrew Agnew. And Agnew was the chairman of the committee, the House of Commons, can you imagine this today? The House of Commons Committee for the Observation of the Sabbath. Can you even imagine that being today? Well, unsurprisingly, Shaftesbury, as Lord Ashley, was a member of this committee, and Agnew was the chair. And it was at a meeting of that committee, the House of Commons Committee on the Observation of the Sabbath, that the conversation took place that we need someone to champion the cause of child labour and its protection in Parliament. And Ashley agreed to take on the mantle. The Act of 1836, introduced by Shaftesbury, brought in a number of reforms and requirements. There were some compromises along the way, inevitably. But it included for the first time a restriction on working hours for children under the age of 13, to 9 hours a day. I mean, we might think this is still quite shocking, really. But at the time, you've got to remember they're going from nothing to something. That's really what's going on. Shaftesbury had wanted restrictions for all women and children under the age of 18, but had to compromise on that. Now, employers got round the system by what was known as the relay system. So, no restriction on how many hours adults can work. So what they would do is they would employ 2 sets of children, and they would work the children the maximum hours that they could work. They would have 1 set of beds in the factory for the children to sleep in if they couldn't get to their homes, and they would literally swap the shifts of the children over to match the adults who were on unlimited working, so they could continue this system of near continuous working. Only in 1844, again thanks to Shaftesbury, were limits placed on both women and children on both daily and weekly hours in the factory. Shaftesbury was also concerned with a wide range of other industrial reform: needlewomen, print workers and miners. This is what he said in a debate in Parliament in 1842 on the employment of women and children in mines. Some of the evils of so hideous a nature they will not admit of delay. They must be instantly removed. Evils that are both disgusting and intolerable. Disgusting they would be in a heathen country, and perfectly intolerable they are in one that professes to call itself Christian. Now, again, in the same way that Wilberforce has modern critics who say, oh, Wilberforce wasn't really interested in freeing the slaves. Wrong terminology. Wilberforce wasn't really interested in ending the slave trade. He was only interested in their conversion. I think I've demonstrated that that wasn't true. So the criticism of Shaftesbury, he was only really concerned about this because women were topless down the pit, and he thought it was an offence against decency. Much deeper than that. Shaftesbury believed that the Christian faith, had public implications and policy implications, and he fought for that view tenaciously. Another area of industrial concern was that of chimney sweeps. Now, prior to mechanisation in the latter part of the 19th century, sweeps would employ children as young as 5 or 6 to climb the narrow flues in order to clean them. So a classic chimney, a chimney flue, narrow. Can't get an adult up there. They didn't have mechanised brushes at this point to go up. How are we going to do it? The younger the child, the better. They can go up the flue, they can take the brush, they can clean it. In fact, again, parents were often culpable and would often sell their children into the employ of the master sweep. Many children died. Some became stuck in the chimneys. Some died from inhalation of fumes or the effect of toxic gases from the hearths and the fires. Shaftesbury introduced legislation to Parliament to ban the employment of children as sweeps in 1840, 1853, 1856, 1864, and in 1875 when the practice was finally outlawed. 25 years. Remember Wilberforce, 18 years to achieve the objectives on the slave trade. The tenacity, the perseverance, only possible because of the drive of that Christian faith. Among the evidence that Shaftesbury presented to Parliament was evidence that the sweeps would nail nails into the feet of children. So a child goes up the flue, doesn't really want to go. How are they going to be encouraged? 2 ways. One, hammering nails into the feet of the child. Child goes up. If that didn't work, or if it was a different sweep, how else are you going to encourage the child to go up the chimney? Oh, light a fire in the hearth. The children suffered sores, bruises, deformities, burns, and death. In Parliament, Shaftesbury described the practice as satanic. The rich, he says, prefer not to ask how their chimneys are cleaned. The country, he said, could never claim to be Christian while such practices continued. In 1872, there was a national outcry when a boy of 8 died in Gateshead, followed by another boy dying in Cambridge. Shaftesbury wrote to the Times, it is, he said, simply a disgrace to England. The Times editorial moved into action and demanded action. The government declined. I think it was Gladstone's government, actually. Could be wrong. But the government of the day declined to take any action, and so Shaftesbury introduced legislation himself again in the Lords, which this time reached the statute book. But again, just note the commitment and the tenacity. Well, a lot more could be said about that, but we need to move on to some other things. Let me talk a little bit about Shaftesbury, the Protestant campaigner. I guess he was a bit of a child of his time. Some of this may sort of make your hair stand on end. I don't have any hair left to stand on its end, so I'm okay. But Shaftesbury was a passionate campaigner for Protestantism. He campaigned for Protestant beliefs in both church and society. He opposed Anglo-Catholicism in the church, on the church campaign. He also forced the closure of the London post office on a Sunday, which caused an absolute outcry when he successfully got that bill through Parliament. And he says the only outcome of this is that the rich will have to wait an extra day to read the gossip. That was what he said. But the workers will be protected, he said, from being forced to work on the Sabbath. He also opposed the reintroduction of the Roman Catholic hierarchy into England in 1851. There's lots of stories I could tell you about that, which I'll have to resist. It was known at the time as the papal aggression. I mean, the language is never moderate in this bit, by the way, but it was known as the papal aggression. And Shaftesbury said, the claim to have a Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster is a territorial claim upon the rights of England. Yeah, you can kind of see where that goes and all the rest of it. But let me just give one example. There was one thing that the election for the Oxford Professorship of Poetry in 1841 was not about, and that was poetry. The leading candidate, in fact, the Professorship of Poetry is still in election by the graduates of the university. The leading candidate was a man called the Reverend Isaac Williams. Now, Isaac Williams was a prominent Tractarian. That is, he belonged to a group of Anglican clergy who sought to detach the Church of England from its reformed roots and were openly sympathetic to the Church of Rome, its doctrine and spiritual practices. And Isaac Williams had written one of the tracts for the Times. That's where their name Tractarian comes from. Just under 100 pamphlets published by this group of clergy, and mostly gathered in and around Oxford, seeking to argue the case for Rome or for Romanism. Williams had written Tract 80. This is the title of Tract 80. Reserve in preaching the doctrine of the atonement. Reserve in preaching the doctrine of the atonement. Now, you can look at this in either a charitable or uncharitable way. Let's be charitable. The principle of reserve, to put it at its most charitable, was that the atonement was such a deep and profound and mysterious matter, the teaching of it should be held back for the baptized, or we might say the converted. But for evangelicals, the atonement was a key converting ordinance. It was not a matter to be held back or put on the back burner. The death of Christ upon the cross was the single most important part of Christian doctrine. The giveaway, of course, was in the title, reserve in preaching the doctrine of the atonement. Now, for reasons I have never been able to work out, and have never discovered why, the chairman of Isaac Williams' election campaign, presumably he was writing around to everyone he could think of to gain support, actually wrote to Ashley, as he was then, Lord Ashley, to seek his support. I don't think Lord Ashley had any idea there was an election going on for the Professorship of Poetry at the University of Oxford. But this letter from Lord Shelbourne then alerted him. And he wrote back. This is the most vicious quote of the afternoon, of the morning. This Shaftesbury does not hold, Lord Ashley, does not hold back in his response. There is no power on earth that shall induce me to assist in the elevation of the writer of that paper, track 90, to the station of public teaching. Even there, just pause, to the station of public teaching. He views that election as this is a public office. I see very little difference between a man who promulgates false doctrine and him who suppresses the truth. I cannot concur in the approval of a candidate whose writings are in contravention of the inspired apostle. I will not consent to give my support, however humble, towards the existence of exoteric and esoteric doctrines in the Church of England, to obscure the perspicuity of the gospel, the clarity of the gospel, by the philosophy of paganism. Now, you see, Lord Shaftesbury, being the sort of person he was, having got the bait, wasn't going to hold back. And he immediately contacted the opposing candidate, the Reverend James Garbett, and within a week was the chairman of the committee responsible for seeking the election of James Garbett. And eventually Isaac Williams, realizing he could not win, withdrew from the race. This was the first of the battles against Anglo-Catholicism which was fought by Shaftesbury in his life. Going back in the early 1830s, when Shaftesbury was on his European tour, in Milan, he was Christian, he found no Protestant place of worship, and so he attended the Catholic cathedral. On one basis, you would think that's not an unreasonable thing to do. Can't find a Protestant place to go, we'll go to the cathedral. And he described the ceremonial that he observed as tedious and unscriptural. Everlasting movement and gesture, with numberless repetitions of robing, candles, incense, and drawling chants. I'm giving you the moderate quotes in this section. I have some more vicious stuff that I'm not sharing. He said the entire service was like a performance. In Vienna, 10 years later, he complained about, quote, bells ringing, priests dancing, incense rising, fiddles playing. He decided back in England that if he was going to oppose this sort of stuff, he needed to make sure he'd visited a similar church in England so that he had some experience. And there is a lengthy diary entry of his visit to the Church of St. Alban in Holborn, in London, which was a leading centre of Anglo-Catholic worship. He said the performance was so theatrical, he expected a curtain to fall at the end. Now, Shaftesbury was clear that the doctrinal implications of Anglo-Catholicism were a threat to the Church of England. He opposed everything, I mean, you can agree or disagree, but he opposed everything from candles on the communion table, quick check up the far end there, good, no candles, priestly vestments, and so on. This is how he described Anglo-Catholicism. I was just thinking whether to tell you a little aside. So when I first went to Wycliffe, which was supposed to be an evangelical and Protestant seminary, theological college of the Church of England, I found sort of candles on the communion table. I didn't quite know what to do, so I took them off. And about 3 days later, they'd reappeared. So we got to the summer break, and one of the guys at the time who'd become one of my close supporters and friends on the staff said to me, "What are we going to do about the candles?" I said, "Well, I took them off, and someone just put them back on." So he says, "Look, you take one and hide it in your office. I'll take the other and hide it in my office. So at worst, they're going to find one." This is what Shaftesbury said about Anglo-Catholicism. Numerous perversions of that unscriptural creed, false and heretical doctrines, the practice of auricular confession, the most monstrous perhaps of all the monstrous practices of the Romish system, histrionic arrangements adapted only to the theatre and impeding all worship in spirit and in truth. And this is probably the really important point, intended to entice the people from the simplicity of the gospel and to lead them to submit to the sacerdotal forgery of a sacrificing priesthood and the necessary and inevitable train of abominable superstitions. Now look, he may have gone over the top. It may be that some judgments weren't the best judgments, but you see his underlying passion for the simplicity of the gospel available to all people. That's what the driving force was. Let me turn to the mission societies then. So Shaftesbury was closely connected with numerous great societies of the day. The Church Pastoral Aid Society, the London City Mission, the Ragged School Union, the London Society for Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews, how to make yourself unpopular, the Church Missionary Society, the British and Foreign Bible Society, and many others, national and local. And these societies encompassed evangelism at home and overseas and social action on the ground. Now, we've seen how Shaftesbury was willing to use legislation to achieve social aims and social ends and social good, to protect the most vulnerable and the weakest in society. Yet he also viewed the role of government as limited, the role of government as remote and lacking in personal care. His commitment, he said, was to the voluntary Christian society, local people of faith working together to meet need in places that they knew well. We'll take two examples. Firstly, Shaftesbury and the London City Mission. City Mission, formed on the 16th of May 1835, Shaftesbury was in the chair of the annual meetings for the City Mission for the whole of the period, from 1835 through to his death in 1885. The City Mission sought to spread the gospel through home visitation of the poorest groups and the poorest people in London, and also to reach out to particular employment groups, such as the flower sellers, the people who sold flowers outside the rail terminus, and the cab drivers. And the city missionaries were often the only people who could penetrate a London slum containing perhaps 20,000 people living in cramped, damp, and dangerous conditions. Now, if you know the centre of London, if you take Theatreland, so what is now Shaftesbury Avenue, named after Shaftesbury, and basically you've got Piccadilly Circus and Cambridge Circus. The area between those two locations, so effectively the area around Shaftesbury Avenue, was one of the biggest slums in central London. It had tens of thousands of people in some of the most horrendous conditions living in that place. Shaftesbury walked the streets of London with the city missionaries, gathering evidence. Oh, remember Wilberforce and the painstaking gathering of evidence. Gathering evidence for his parliamentary campaigns. And he would appear in Parliament the next day, reporting on what he could find. He would encourage the Christian workers and preached the gospel. He also, interestingly, in his work on mental health, he was an inspector of mental health establishments, and he said we lock people up too quickly and we let them out not quickly enough. And he would appear at 2 a.m. in the morning as an inspector. Random inspection, 2 a.m. in the morning to inspect the conditions. Next day in Parliament reporting what he had discovered. But by way of illustration, there is the most remarkable story of Lord Ashley, as he then was, encountering some of the hardest criminals in the city in London. Crucial to his approach was a combination of self-help, social provision, and spiritual salvation. Those were the three mantras: self-help, social provision, and spiritual salvation. In 1848, he was invited by a city missionary by the name of Thomas Jackson to accompany him to a meeting of London's convicted felons, right in the midst of that estate that I've been describing. Do you remember that picture of Lord Shaftesbury right at the beginning? I mean, he really does look like an aristocrat, doesn't he? You know, this is an aristocrat. That was the National Portrait Gallery portrait. He's an aristocratic gentleman. What an extraordinary scene it must have been for this English aristocrat in the company of Jackson to walk into the heart of one of London's most notorious slums. 3 meetings were held, and a total of 394 convicts attended. And Ashley had 2 aims: to preach the gospel. He stood on a soapbox, and the first thing he did was preach from the scriptures, preach the gospel of salvation, and to assist these individuals then to find a new life, sought to persuade them both to help themselves, to lift themselves out of the quagmire in which they found themselves, and provided support for some schemes of training and emigration in order to enable that to happen. Quite extraordinary scene. Second example, the ragged schools. Now, yes, again, we're back to Victorian terminology. The name seems rather quaint and old-fashioned, even Victorian. Shaftesbury was associated with the ragged school movement for over 40 years, and it was one of the main ways in which he expressed his commitment on the ground to Christian social welfare. So, prior to the period up to 1870, there was spasmodic provision of schooling by various charitable schools, but in every case, the poorest were excluded. Even charitable schools at the time often had minimum standards of footwear and clothing and cleanliness, and the poorest of the poor didn't meet those standards. And many of the early ragged schools came into existence through the efforts of individual city missionaries. The umbrella body, the Ragged School Union, came into being on the 5th of July 1844, Lord Ashley as the president. The basic aim was the education of the poor, so that the poor could, of course, read the Bible, but there was also a wider educational objective in the second annual report, put like this: that of removing every ragged, destitute child from our streets and to the placing of that child in the path of industry and virtue. That's actually quite a wide educational aim. It's not a narrow aim. And they achieved the outworking of that by the establishment of schools of industry attached to the ragged school. So the classic ragged school would be a building in which the children would be taught. It would be open maybe 3 evenings a week, perhaps 2 days a week. It wasn't full-time. But attached to the school would be a school of industry where there might be a tailor or a cobbler employed to teach the children a trade. And on the other side of the school, there would be a penny bank in order to encourage the virtue of saving. The penny bank was to encourage saving at the lowest level. If you're poor, you don't have much money. And the banks of the day had minimum amounts they would accept as deposits. And so the penny banks were established in order to encourage the children of the poor to put a penny a week into the bank on deposit. So you see, you've got a holistic view. This is not just doling out social provision. It's encouraging a holistic view of an individual endowed with dignity by God. Train a child in a trade. Encourage the virtue of saving. And you help put that person on a path to a more fulfilled life. Tailors, shoemakers. The Shoe Blacks Brigade was founded at this time to provide employment. Now, the extent and influence of the movement grew rapidly. The first annual report in 1845 reported 20 schools, 2,000 children, and 200 teachers. In 1868, 24 years later, there were 257 schools and over 31,000 children involved in ragged schools. And the annual reports comment on RSU activities, Ragged School Union activities. This is the sorts of things they covered. Industrial classes, shoe black brigades, refugees, placing scholars in employment, emigration, mothers' meetings, libraries, penny banks, clothing funds, meals societies, sanitary associations, libraries, flower shows, rag collecting, shoe clubs, coal clubs, provident clubs, saving societies, barrow clubs, and Emily loan funds, which I'll come to in a minute. What you have here is a picture of the Christian voluntary principle in practice. So the long view of the history of how Christians have approached social welfare is of a limited role for government and a passion for the voluntary principle in local communities and local churches. Now, the Emily loan funds were named after Shaftesbury's late wife, Emily Cooper, and that was an early example of microfinance. The Emily loan funds would make loans available to the flower seller outside Waterloo Station, because what does the flower seller outside Waterloo Station do in the winter? Because in those days you couldn't import from Jersey. There were no flowers. how was the individual to maintain a living? And so the Emily Loan Fund would provide a loan to enable the flour sellers to buy either stock of goods that were able to be sold in winter, or the classic example was a potato oven to enable them to roast potatoes in order to be able to sell those. Simple repayment schemes were established, and capital provided by Christian philanthropists. The penny banks taking small deposits on a weekly basis. Now, ragged schools were not glamorous. They often met in crowded and inadequate conditions, perhaps a room as little as 15 feet square, so really quite a small room, into which were crammed 50 to 60 children and 8 to 10 teachers, occasionally employed but almost entirely voluntary. The majority were women. Well, you get to 1870 and you get the introduction of compulsory state education. Shaftesbury was scathing about the introduction of compulsory state education in 1870. This is quite a tough quote too. This is what he said. The godless non-Bible system is at hand, and the ragged schools with all their divine polity, he was a bit of a romantic, the ragged schools with all their divine polity, with all their burning and fruitful love for the poor, with all their prayers and harvests for the temporal and eternal welfare of forsaken, heathenish, destitute, sorrowful, and yet innocent children, must perish under this all-conquering march of intellectual power. Our nature is nothing, the heart is nothing, in the estimation of these zealots of secular knowledge. Everything for the flesh and nothing for the soul. Everything for time and nothing for eternity. You can, on a graph, mark the collapse of the ragged schools from 1870 onwards. Danger of getting political. The debate about taxation of private schools today is, I'm sure, complicated, and there might be a wide range of views even in this room. But if you just step back a step or two and realize that among those schools are those that are dedicated to the provision of Christian teaching, not for the wealthiest, but for the poorest in society, through bursaries and scholarships, it's just a reminder of why, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this view of state education, but it's just a reminder of why Shaftesbury was so scathing about the introduction of one monolithic model of state education. Anyway, let's move on to the last thing I want to mention, a fascinating aspect of Shaftesbury's life and work, which combines his passion for evangelism and religious liberty. Evangelicals, including Shaftesbury, wished to make Christian worship more accessible to the working class. You do realise the reason that evening services were first introduced was because the servants in the big houses in London were not able to go to morning service because they had to cook lunch for the household. And the first reason why evening services were introduced was to provide some possibility for those people in that position to attend Christian worship. But there were problems. The working class tended not to want to go to church. It was too sort of class-based, if you like, or too alien. And so evangelicals, including Shaftesbury, wanted to make Christian worship more accessible to the working class and to have an evangelistic intent. And in good classic evangelical style, without undue power or influence resting in the hands of the bishops. Now, in 1857, worship services commenced on Sunday evenings in Exeter Hall, which was on the Strand, and it doesn't exist anymore. Exeter Hall was a hall on the Strand in London, and it became known as the meeting place of the evangelical societies. So the May meetings, the annual meetings of the societies, all would take place in this hall called Exeter Hall on the Strand. And it was in Exeter Hall in 1857 that the first step was made to enable an evening service aimed at the wider population. Now, of course, Exeter Hall was not a church, but a meeting place. But there was an immediate attempt by some clergy to use the 1855 Religious Worship Act to prevent the services from happening, because the building was not consecrated. So, supposed to hold religious services in consecrated buildings. This building wasn't consecrated, and so the opponents, if you like, took action. When I was a vicar in Basingstoke, I discovered that my church was not consecrated, and the bishop discovered the church was not consecrated. And the bishop said to me, "Oh, Richard, your church isn't consecrated." He said, "Would you like me to come down and consecrate it?" So I looked at it and said, "Nah, don't bother." As I mean, I did say to her, "You can if you want, but no one will turn up because nobody's interested." But it was quite interesting to discover that my church wasn't consecrated. It meant you could do anything. That was really the sort of the advantage of it. Anyway, the Sunday evening services at Exeter Hall were very successful. And so then the question was, how can we expand this provision? This was Shaftesbury's description of one of the Exeter Hall services. An attendance of more than 3,000. Just pause there. 3,000 people on a Sunday evening service. I mean, I don't know how many you get here. 60, 30, 40? I have no idea. But I mean, you know, in most churches, you don't have evening services anymore. And in some churches, 10 or 20 is a good number. You may do better than that, but that's I bet you don't get 3,000. An attendance of more than 3,000. Order, decency, attention, even devotion. They sang well and lustily and repeated the responses to the litany. Brackets, the only part of the liturgy used. Another service this evening, fuller than before. Hundreds sent away. I'm just trying to paint a picture of what it was like. So in January 1860, 5 London theatres, including the Garrick, opened for public worship. Can you even imagine that? 5 London theatres opened for public worship. The average attendance was 20,000 a week, many of whom were listening to the word of God for the first time. Shaftesbury assisted, as did many clergy, in many of these services, reading from the Bible, and it was mainly the poor, the labourers, the factory workers and domestic staff who formed the congregations. You would have thought the church would think this was a good idea. The archbishops opposed. 24th of February 1860, Lord Dungannon rose in the House of Lords to move a resolution declaring such services led by the clergy of the Church of England to be irregular, inconsistent with order, and wait for it, injurious to the advance of religion. How can it possibly be injurious to the advance of religion to share the gospel with just a group of people who don't hear the gospel just because it's not in a consecrated church building? Shaftesbury rose from his seat. The services, he said, were aimed at those who did not frequent regular places of worship. In addition, he said, in London, many people are nomadic, moving from place to place. These circumstances, he said, required special means. Many, he said, of the Church of England had joined together in this enterprise. Many of the Church of England and nonconformists had joined together in this enterprise. He added, I question whether any human being or any law has the power of preventing a clergyman in his capacity as a Christian citizen from performing that great duty, the salvation of souls, in season and out of season, at all times and in all places, to any who may be disposed to hearken. He had in his pocket a letter written to him by a clergyman of the Church of England who had taken part in these services. Shaftesbury produces this letter in the House of Lords and reads it out. This is from the letter, therefore. I presume the right of Christian men to exhort an ungodly multitude wherever found ought not to be interfered with. And it was only as a Christian man that I addressed the multitude in the Garrick Theatre. I wore no ecclesiastical dress and used no part of the church service. So all my evangelical minister friends who think it's all terribly contemporary to get rid of wearing, I don't wear clerical robes, but to get rid of wearing clerical robes, actually it's not. They were up to it in the 1860s as well. Shaftesbury complained bitterly that the Church of England, wait for this one, this is interesting, despite the pressing and fearful necessity, is bound so tightly by rule and rubric and law and custom that she can do none of the work. Let me conclude. Shaftesbury campaigned on some incredibly wonderful and important matters, and he also campaigned on some things that were as unpopular in his day as they would be in ours. God used Shaftesbury in remarkable ways. The extraordinary range of his commitments and interests, his passion for faith in the public square, his tenacity, his refusal to surrender his evangelical principles, his independence of mind, his integrity, all contributed to his impact, which we see today, even today, on the statute book and in the numerous voluntary societies and their successors. At the funeral at Westminster Abbey, thousands, more than 100,000 people, lined the streets of London, holding aloft, you can see some pictures of it if you look far enough, holding aloft banners with Bible verses, bands gathering together to play, representatives of more than 200 voluntary Christian societies, thousands inside and outside the Abbey, singing Charles Wesley's hymn, "Come, let us join our friends above." There is now a memorial, of course, to Shaftesbury in Piccadilly Circus, as well as Shaftesbury Avenue. What an extraordinary man whose story deserves to be better known. So, there we are. We do have a few minutes now. I think we're aiming to finish at noon, so we do have 10 minutes for questions. And I think there's a microphone there. So if you had a burning question from the first session that you weren't able to ask, feel free to ask it now or on this session, or any wider general observation or comment. Any either questions, thoughts, reflections? No, well, no. Yeah.
When we are told that we are living in a post-Christian era, would it be wrong to think of those times of Shaftesbury and Wilberforce as a sort of a Christian era, if they were at that time equally lonely and resisted as Christians might be today?
Great question. So, it's part of this, oh, well, that was a Christian era, so it was easier to do those things, whereas now it's not. I don't think it was a Christian era. It was just as challenging then as now. And Shaftesbury, if you read through his diaries, I haven't read all his diaries. His diaries currently reside in the archive of Southampton University. And as a young researcher 30 years ago, I sort of trotted along thinking, oh, this will be good. I've got a week and a half. I can sort of read through the diaries. And they produced for me 20 volumes of handwritten, incomprehensible sort of writing. And I started, and I was comparing to some notes that I'd got, so I managed to compare those, and you're looking for the golden nuggets, and you occasionally find one. I couldn't get through them all. But what you do get from Shaftesbury's diaries is a recognition of the challenge of the secular nature of the times even then. You get, there was one, and of the church, to be honest. I mean, I kind of make a few jokes about it, but, the challenge of how the church was then is no better than it was now. And there was one famous vote where he recorded in his diaries, I remember what he said in his day. He says, "What use the bishops?" Because he turned up to Parliament, 2 bishops have voted one way, 2 bishops have voted the other way, and the rest hadn't turned up at all. So he wrote, like, what use the bishops? So there was challenge, and there was all the time. And I think, although there was revival, there were Christians, you also have vast increase in population. And so it's a constant battle as to how to bring the faith to bear. And I think that's true then and true today. But thank you. Good question. Just one addition to that. There was a man in 1830 called Spencer Perceval. Now, Spencer Perceval was the son of the only prime minister ever assassinated in England. So Spencer Perceval Sr. was assassinated in the lobby of the House of Commons in 1812, just by a nutter. There wasn't a motive, just a nut. His son, converted evangelical Christian, but I have to say, completely at one end of the spectrum. And what Percival used to do in Parliament, not very effectively, was he'd stand up in Parliament and immediately start quoting from the scriptures. So if you read Spencer Percival's speeches, it's all scripture, it's all scriptural. You wouldn't disagree with any of it, but he had no impact. So what Shaftesbury and Wilberforce managed to do was to take the faith and be able to translate it into the public square. Someone else had a question.
We are completely appalled at the idea of slavery or child labour, but that is with the benefit of the intervening years. Clearly, the people of those times did not all feel abhorrence, else there'd have been no need for a campaign.
Yeah.
How do we discern what is evil in our own society?
Yeah. So again, it's a great question. So that's true. As I said in the Wilberforce speech, you know, for many years, slavery was accepted as a norm. Child labour in factories was possibly becoming slightly more quickly seen as unacceptable, but there were still many of those same arguments. So, how do you discern what is evil in society? Firstly, I think you need long perspective. You need faith and providence and trust in God. We need to learn from those of history and those of the past, and we need some theological principles. So, for example, let me give one example. So take what will happen in Parliament on Thursday, this next week, where Kim Leadbitter, the Labour MP for Batley and Spen, I think, will introduce a bill to provide for, well, she's calling it the assisted dying bill. Now, is it easy? No. Are there some complexities in the debate around that? Of course. Do you understand why some people come from a slightly different position? Yes, you get it. But if our theological principle is the dignity of the human person, why is our theological principle the dignity of the human person? Because humanity is made in the image of God, Genesis 1:27, 1:28. Therefore, endowed with dignity. Then we might take a view that anything that contradicts that dignity is something that is not to be endorsed. I've just come back from Canada, who in 2016 introduced so-called assisted dying. It appears now to be compulsory. And to be fair, the Canadian government has just suspended an attempt, no, not an attempt, suspended a plan to introduce assisted dying for the mentally ill. Well, actually, they've only suspended it for a 3-year period. They've delayed it, not suspended it. There's moves in Canada now to introduce it for children. So it's not a proper answer to your question because it's hard and it's difficult to discern. But I think you have to go back to long perspective, look back at how people have responded in the past, Christians responded, and the basic theological principles like the dignity of the human person and the divine image. So it's not going to produce a perfect answer. I can't just produce you a checklist, if only I could. But I think that's what I'd encourage people to do. And
I'm intrigued by Shaftesbury's perceived antagonism to a national state system of education, which to me seems to promote a division between the secular and the religious, and say that there can be no influence of the church in the secular world, which seems to be contradictory to other things.
Yes. Well, it's also a great question. So, even at the time, the defence of the Forster's Education Act in 1870 was that this is not getting rid of the Bible from schools. That will still be available. And you, Shaftesbury, you and Spurgeon and others, you all sort of got a bit, you've gone a bit over the top, and you've got a bit obsessed with that. I think there were two reasons why he expressed himself as he did. He was worried about a monolithic provision, that there was only going to be a state system, and he was concerned about his voluntary, ragged schools. It was interesting that both he and Spurgeon, who was a Baptist, actually came together to resist the 1870. I'm not saying I'm opposed to the 1870 education Act or state education. I'm trying to understand what their motives were. So I think it was trying to avoid a monolithic thing and his passion for the voluntary schools. I have one story which I will keep as the last thing when Simon says we've got to finish, about Shaftesbury and Spurgeon.
We're nearly out of time. Want to honour your time here. I'm sure Richard will be happy to chat afterwards. One last question, Alan.
Was his life ever in danger? Was he ever physically assaulted for his what he was doing for the young children?
So I don't know that his life was ever in physical danger. He was certainly jostled and certainly encouraged physical opposition. Not sure it ever extended to danger in the same way that Spencer Perceval was assassinated and others, to be fair. Shall I just tell my last story? So the final story is, Shaftesbury is one of the great heroes of the 19th century. If I was talking to a Baptist audience, they would say, no, Charles Spurgeon is the great hero. They were both great heroes. They knew each other. They were fascinating. Shaftesbury a Tory, Spurgeon a Liberal, using the terminology of the days. And Shaftesbury would go and visit Spurgeon, and Spurgeon would deliberately put Liberal Party posters up in his window to annoy Shaftesbury on his arrival at the gate. The reason Spurgeon was a Liberal was actually mostly, Spurgeon was it was actually state sponsorship of education was really the thing that sort of motivated him, but they actually came together over that. Here's the story. So, 1885, Spurgeon's 50th birthday. He writes to Shaftesbury saying, Shaftesbury died in 1885. He writes to Shaftesbury saying, please would you come and preside over my birthday party? Shaftesbury writes back saying, nah, dear Charles, too old, I'm exhausted, I'm at the end of my life, you don't want an old codger like me. Spurgeon writes back, dear Shaftesbury, if you get tired during the proceedings, you may sit down. If you need to leave early, you can leave early. Please come, interestingly, please come and preside over a meeting of the orphanage, as the social side, and then the birthday party. I want a good, old-fashioned evangelical like you. And that was a letter that I published in there, but has never been published, between Spurgeon and Shaftesbury. There we go.
Richard, I mean, we've all been listening intently and we've learned so much, and we're very, very grateful actually for your research and also being able to communicate it in a way that's so accessible to everybody. So let's just show our appreciation, shall we?
Thank you.
So, and thanks for those who joined online. This, you can listen to it again or send it on to catch up. Richard will be here preaching tomorrow morning on the Fifth Commandment. So do come back for that. And just before you go, if you can just help get the building ready for tomorrow morning, a little bit of assistance putting chairs away and clearing away would be much appreciated. We do have another Saturday morning study, similar format to this, with Dr. Tim Ward from Oak Hill, who will be speaking on reading, interpreting and handling the Bible well. And again, another great speaker this term. So do put that in your diary for another Saturday morning like this. But thanks for your time this morning and look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
The Wilberforce book, remember, is free of charge. Just take one. The Shaftesbury book is £10.